Informed Choice Radio, episode 498, Cannabis Investments, What You Need to Know, with Stuart Forbes from Rize ETF.
Live from Sundial House Studios, this is Informed Choice Radio. Want to make the most of your money and your life? You've come to the right place. Now, here's your host, Martin Bamford.
When you think about new investment trends, what pops into your head? Bitcoin, renewable energy, cannabis? Today on the podcast, we're talking about investing in medical marijuana with my guest, Stuart Forbes. Stuart is a co-founder of Rize ETF and their product lead. Rize ETF develop exchange-traded funds, ETFs, offering access to investment megatrends. They're creating a new way of investing, one that enables investors of all stripes to invest in the future whilst remaining on the right side of history. Stuart is a qualified solicitor and was previously head of ETF product development at Legal and General Investment Management, and prior to that at ETF Securities, where he was responsible for ETF development and structuring, platform management and legal. So here's my conversation with Stuart Forbes, co-founder of Rize ETF, in episode 498 of Informed Choice Radio. So Stuart, perhaps you could start with a bit of an introduction. Tell us a bit about you and about your background and what it is you do.
So I'm one of the founders of Rize ETF. We specialize in building thematic ETFs or thematic funds. So funds that have a focus on a specific theme. And typically that's a new sector. So for example, cybersecurity and medical cannabis. Those are two emerging and fast-growing sectors. Both totally different, but both very, very relevant. As a team, we built the Cannabis platform, the UCITS ETF platform at ETF Securities that was then acquired by Legal and General in 2018. And again, we really pioneered this whole thematic investing approach in the ETF format in Europe. And we launched the first robotics ETF in 2014. We followed that up with the cybersecurity ETF in 2015. And then we continued on with battery technology and a number of others. So we very much pioneered this. We work with, so for each theme, we work with experts in that particular sector, in that emerging sector, to be able to identify all the companies that are relevant to that sector so that we can capture them in our ETF. So that's our specialty, effectively. We left Legal in General in 2000 and at the end of 2018 to set up Rize as a specialist thematic ETF provider. So that's what we're focused on. We're no longer providing a broader range of products. We want to focus exclusively on thematic ETFs, which is what we're known for.
And I hope you'll say this the right way, but you don't look like a traditional fund manager. So what's your background? How have you come into this profession? So
actually, I'm a lawyer by background, and I'm not a fund manager myself. One of our colleagues, one of the other co-founders, Anthony Martin, he was the head of portfolio management, both at ETF Securities and Legal in General. So he's on our founding team as well. And we also have Rahul Bhushan, who's our sort of leading product specialist or investment specialist, if you like, on the team as well. So it's a little bit different in ETFs, the way we do it, the way we structure the teams. I was head of product development at ETF Securities and Legal in General. So I was responsible for building the funds. So we've got quite a diverse team here that capture all the expertise that go into I guess building a new fund, which is I think a little bit different to actively managed funds that you might be used to, where you just have a fund manager that you would normally be speaking to.
No, absolutely. So if we can get back to basics before we dive into some of these interesting themes, sure. Particularly cannabis, medical cannabis, ETF. So what for the uninitiated, what's an ETF?
So an ETF is the same as any other UCITS fund. So most people in Europe are, retail investors are investing in UCITS funds typically, whether they're a mutual fund or an ETF. The ETF is just an innovation that's come around over the last sort of 15 years or so, and it's growing increasingly popular. But it's a UCITS fund, right? The only difference is that it's a UCITS fund that you can also buy and sell like a stock on the stock market. So it's an enhanced feature of the ETF. There's a secondary market there that enables you to buy and sell it like a stock in your ISA or your self-invested pension plan, SIP. It's really just an innovation in the way that people can buy and sell it, and they tend to be more transparent in terms of fee structure, and they tend to be cheaper than traditional UCITS funds, which is why you're seeing such a huge take up across Europe in terms of allocation to ETFs and moving away from mutual funds.
So tell me about cannabis. So we're obviously hearing a lot about cannabis as an investment opportunity. I believe being legalized now for medical purposes in Germany, Canada. I hear a lot about, and obviously some parts of the United States too. So firstly, what's the current position with the legal position of cannabis, both here in the UK but also more globally?
So there's two different things, right? There's medical cannabis and whether it's legal or not in a country. And then there's investing in medical cannabis, which is a separate thing. So in many cases, medical cannabis might be illegal in a particular country in Europe, but you can still invest in it, right? Because the activity is being carried out abroad, say in Canada or something like that. So medical cannabis was legalized in the United Kingdom in 2018, November 2018. And it really came on the back of social pressure from, there were a couple of children who had epilepsy, and cannabis was the only treatment that was able to help them. But they weren't able to get it here. And there were lots of high profile instances of parents arriving at the airport here in the UK with their cannabis in hand. And therefore there's a lot of pressure being put on the government to, allow this treatment, allow this medication to be issued to these patients. So there was a lot of pressure there, and in the UK they then legalized it in 2018. So I think now the question in the UK is really creating that access, because it's one thing to legalize something, it's another thing to have the infrastructure in place and the training and issued to all the medical professionals in the UK, so that they know what to actually prescribe and how to prescribe it and what to prescribe it for. Because that's one of the biggest challenges that we keep hearing at conferences, medical cannabis conferences here in the UK. People say, look, I've got this condition, I know it's been legalized, but I still can't get it. So that's been a challenge in a number of different countries that have legalized it. Legalization obviously happens, the governments tick a box from a political point of view, but do they actually meet the demand? That's a different question, and that's the challenge now that's being faced. And actually, things are developing here in the UK. Clinics are opening up, and that infrastructure is being put in place, and we expect to see a much larger take-up of the use of medical cannabis in the UK and also in the rest of Europe as that access point continues to grow.
How does the UK compare to other countries then in terms of its position? Because often we're a long way behind countries when it comes to innovations like this.
Yeah, I think the UK is right up there now. I think the other thing that a lot of people don't realize is, and this is also linked to the investment side of medical cannabis, which as I said is different to medical cannabis itself. Whether medical cannabis is legal and whether you can get it is different to whether you can invest in it, right? I think in the UK, what people don't realize is that in 2018, the UK was the largest exporter of medical cannabis in the world. The UK as a country was the largest exporter of medical cannabis in the world. And principally that was because of GW Pharma. GW Pharma is the largest pure play medical cannabis pharmaceutical company in the world, right? And they produce all of their cannabis here in the UK. A lot of it is grown by a company called British Sugar, which a lot of people know. And what people don't know is that they grow cannabis for GW Pharma. They replaced a lot of their tomato growing facility with a cannabis growing facility. It's a very good example of a company that people aren't necessarily aware of, and they're not aware of the sort of extent to which the UK has already moved into this space. I think where there's still a lot of room to grow is in the cultivation of hemp and the use of the flower of the hemp plant to create CBD products and everything else, because that still hasn't happened yet. So what happens now in the UK is that if you're growing hemp, if you're a hemp farmer, you have to destroy the flower, which is where all the CBD is contained, and you can only use the stems for production of fiber, and you can use the seeds for use in cereals and pressing for oil and other things.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, I mean, yeah, I was unaware that the UK had that status of being such a large exporter of this. And what are the investment opportunities then? Is this about investing in the grower, in the production facility, in the distribution of it? And where do the investment opportunities come about?
So I think it's really important to distinguish and to sort of isolate out the medical cannabis opportunity from the broader cannabis opportunity. So we're obviously focused on the medical cannabis, whereas you've got this broader legal cannabis industry, which is recreational cannabis, branded, edibles, gummy bears and all these kind of things, which you have in Canada and in many of the states within the US. That's not what we're talking about. In that broader sector, that broader cannabis sector, what you're finding is the production of cannabis itself is becoming heavily commoditized, and it will continue to do so, because cannabis is a tropical plant. It doesn't want to grow in the northern climate, right? So to grow it in the northern climate, you can grow it in the summertime, or you can grow it in greenhouses. Both of those are relatively inefficient compared to growing it in a hot country where all the conditions are sort of naturally available for you to produce more cheaply. And also labor costs are lower in some of these other countries that the production we see shifting to. For example, Colombia, a lot of production is shifting there. A lot of companies have been investing in Colombia. Even China is a place where production is relatively cheaper and expected to grow, but it is limited to hemp as opposed to cannabis containing higher levels of THC. But within medical cannabis specifically, we're focusing very much on the medical and pharmaceutical applications of that. And that's where we're seeing a huge amount of interest and an increase in demand. And specifically pharmaceutical cannabis, we have a whole. I think more than 50% of the companies in our basket are pharmaceutical cannabis companies. Some of them are pure play, some of them aren't pure play, and are big pharma big pharma companies that are starting to move into the medical cannabis space. So they've made serious moves, whether it's through a subsidiary or not, in terms of distribution of medical cannabis, or they're filing for patents and things like that. So we're starting to see a lot of the big pharma companies dip their toes now into this market, and it's not something that they would do lightly. So if Novartis, one of its subsidiaries called Sanofi, has engaged in a global distribution agreement for medical cannabis, that would have been signed off at the highest level by Novartis. There's no way they would have allowed that to happen unless it was considered at the highest level, because of the press that would have come with an announcement like that. So we are seeing this growing interest in this market from some of the big pharma companies as well. But there is in terms of where we see it growing, there's a convergence of different things that are creating this interest in medical cannabis and the growth of the market. I think one of them is obviously support from institutions like the World Health Organization, which reclassified cannabis in February 2019. So that support has had that's all. I mean, you obviously know from COVID-19 that the World Health Organization is hugely influential globally. So that reclassification has done a lot of good in terms of helping to persuade people and governments to amend legislation to legalize medical cannabis. I think the other thing is there's a groundswell of support amongst the general populace in all these different countries. We did and I think one of the things to point out is that if you ask around your friends, next time you're having a beer over Zoom with your friends, because obviously we can't have a beer in person at the moment, ask them, are any of you using CBD or medical cannabis for any conditions that you might have? And you will discover that, especially amongst the older generation, there are a lot of people that are already taking it for things like pain, lower back pain and neck pain, where it's been proven to be very effective. And we were presenting at the CityWire event last week, and we had the final slot of the day, and we had a huge turnout of people listening in, and we had a couple of people message in. These are discretionary fund managers. These are professionals in the investment space. They messaged in saying, I've been using this now for the last couple of years. I wish I'd known about it before, because it's been so great. So I think there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that it amongst people and their friends that it's working, and that's creating a lot of groundswell and support for the further take up of it. That's a huge area, right? Another area that we've seen in the US in particular is it's being used as a mitigant for the opioid crisis. So, for example, in Illinois instituted a new program whereby anybody that was being prescribed opioids could then sign up as an alternative for the medical cannabis program, the state-sponsored medical cannabis program, where they could get medical cannabis prescribed as an alternative or as a supplement to the opioids. And we see this as a huge benefit, because this is in the treatment of pain. And this is hugely beneficial because, for a start, cannabis is cheaper than opioids, but it's not addictive in the same way that opioids are. So the idea here is that it can either be a full replacement for opioids, or if the pain is particularly acute on certain days, you take your opioids and then you supplement the rest of the time with the medical cannabis, which again doesn't have the same addictive traits as opioids. So we see a huge amount of potential there going forward. So yes, I think that's really it. I think the social acceptance point is huge in terms of driving the future legalization, and therefore the take up of medical cannabis in Europe, but also globally. This is very much a global story. It's not just a North American story anymore.
And typically an ETF will, as you mentioned, a basket of stocks earlier, so it'll invest in and almost track an index in a sense. So what's the index that you're looking at here? Who's responsible for deciding what goes into it, and how constituent parts are chosen?
So so for all of the products that we build everything from scratch. So this is what we specialize in. So we will identify a growing theme, a future theme, one that we think is gonna continue to grow in the coming years. And what we do is we don't profess to be experts in every particular theme, right? It wouldn't be possible for us to be experts in absolutely everything. So therefore, it's essential that we work with experts in each theme to make sure we properly capture it. And what you'll see in other thematic products and other funds out there that purport to provide exposure to a theme, they typically license an off-the-shelf index from a firm like MSCI or FTSE or Stocks or Solactive or these sort of traditional index houses, and they have word search technology that they use to filter, sift through financial statements to identify keywords like medical cannabis to figure out whether a company is relevant. But there's no qualitative element to that. There's no looking at the revenues and engaging with the companies to find out actually they don't necessarily report against medical cannabis in their financial statements, but are they engaged? Because it seems like they are. So then there's an engagement with the companies, and a qualitative assessment would be made potentially over how relevant that company is to the sector. So it's not only identifying the companies that's really important, but it's also which sectors within the broader medical cannabis sector are you looking to capture. And again, it's very important that you're working with people who know that industry inside out. So for us, we've worked with a firm called New Frontier Data, who are the global leaders in cannabis industry intelligence. So these guys are advising all the major financial institutions that you could think of in terms of their cannabis policy and activities as they start to move in and start to support the industry and investment in the industry. So we're working with them they defined the universe of companies that we pull from into the index. So we split that. We've broken it down. Well, they've broken it down into a number of different subsectors. One of them is cultivation and retail, right? So that is all the companies that are growing and producing cannabis products for the recreational market, the adult use market. We don't include any of those in the index. And we end up with the pharmaceutical cannabis companies and medical cannabis companies, which would include vertically integrated companies that are both growing it and then producing the medicinal grade cannabis for either use or in the relevant country or export. And we also include, like I said before, some of the big pharma companies that are starting to move into the space because we see a huge, we expect their activities there to really ramp up over the coming years. So that's our main focus within the fund. So that universe is pulled into an index, and then the index will select the companies based on a minimum market cap and liquidity criteria to make sure that we're only capturing companies that are sufficiently liquid. Because as an emerging market, as an emerging industry, there are a lot of small companies out there. So we'll see more and more coming into the index as the global market continues to grow. So we have companies from Australia, from Israel, from the United States, from Canada, from Colombia, from the UK, obviously GW Pharma, and we expect more in Europe to be coming to market at some point soon as well, as the European market takes off, and Europe decides that it wants to be in this space rather than importing everything from elsewhere, which is currently the case for the most part.
I was going to ask as well about market cap then. So as well as the big pharma who are starting to get involved in this space, is it typically smaller businesses, smaller companies you're investing in? And what challenges does that create in terms of liquidity and investing in small cap companies?
Yeah, so we have a minimum market cap of $30 million US, which is the lowest I think we've ever had for a thematic fund. And we have a minimum 3-month average daily value traded requirement of $100,000. So this is and we liquidity weight the portfolio as well. So companies are weighted according to their relative liquidity. This is really important because the market cap weight does exclude a lot of the companies that would otherwise be particularly challenging for us. But the way that we've previously done this with some of our old themes, which were new themes at the time that we built the funds, was that we enabled the funds to scale over time, and we would increase those liquidity and market cap requirements over time as the funds grew. And that just enables us, if you get a fund that's up to say 500 million, $1 billion in size, you want to increase those limits so that you're not impacting the companies themselves in terms of any trades in the fund. So it's a flexibility that you have in the index to sort of increase those thresholds over time. But yeah, certainly in the beginning, it was it's obviously a challenge when you're looking at a brand new industry to find sufficient companies that are providing you with that exposure to the theme that are of sufficient size for UCITS to be able to buy in and buy out, which is the key requirement around liquidity. Can the fund buy the companies, and then if an investor wants to sell out of the fund, can the fund sell the companies to facilitate that divestment? So that was a key part of the build process for the fund, and that's where having within our team of expertise, we had the head, the ex-head of portfolio management from Legal & General and ETF Securities was part of our team. So he's very instrumental in the construction and the rules that go into the construction of the index that enable that to be sufficiently liquid.
And how do valuations look in this sector now? Because I know for a while now it's been a hot sector, and in some cases we've seen multiples looking at ridiculous levels. So is that the case as well in the medical side? I know for the recreational side it got overinflated massively. Has it been a bit more sensible on the medical side?
We believe so. If you look at the performance of our index over the past year, we didn't suffer the same decline in value that the broader market, legal cannabis market that I mentioned before saw. They've obviously seen huge declines in value, whereas we were relatively flat on the year. And I think that's down to our focus being more medical as opposed to recreational. I think, yes, like what happened in 2017 was you had a ton of money flocking into the global sort of cannabis opportunity. And a lot of that money was US based, and a lot of that money is retail. So in the US, for example, I can tell you that 50% of ETF investors are retail investors. Mm-hmm. So end people like us who are investing their own cash, not on an advised basis or anything. They're just doing it themselves. Whereas in Europe, that is like 10%, right? So the proportion of retail investors in Europe to US investors is really, really low. It's growing, but it's very low. So what that means is that in the US, you come out with a new theme like not medical cannabis, they don't have a medical cannabis ETF in the US, but a cannabis ETF or a robotics ETF or these themes. There's a huge amount of pent-up demand for these sort of things. People understand them and therefore they invest in them. But it means that you'll see, in some cases, you'll see opportunities like that take a huge amount of money when actually it maybe wasn't the best. And I think as a new industry, there's definitely been a question over the quality of the directors taken in by some of these companies. Some of the smaller companies listed on some of the smaller exchanges, you'd have to look at the CVs of some of these guys in question. Some of the statements that have been made by the companies. All of these companies have projected growth that was, that wasn't really feasible, and the harsh light of day is kind of shone on these companies to a certain degree, and so we've seen an adjustment in terms of their values. But I think what we've tried to do and what we've done is we've focused on companies that are only listed on major exchanges. So we don't invest in companies that are listed on the Canadian Securities Exchange, for example. We'll only invest in them if they're listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange or the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ. So they have much more stringent requirements around, who's appointed to the board, corporate governance requirements, all these sort of things that are really, really important. You're not going to get a listing on one of those major markets. We're certainly not going to keep your listing on any of those major markets unless you're producing legal opinions at the point of listing, but also your board is reputable. So for us, that's really important. And, there's a lot more scrutiny on these kind of companies now than there was. Again, our focus on the medical sector, more specifically, we're not focused on the sort of retail, recreational, adult use sector so much. So it's very much about the efficacy of the drugs and things that are being produced by these companies. And so that's where we see, the opportunity in the long run here in Europe in particular. And that's what we're focused on.
Stuart, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time today and for educating us, enlightening us around this interesting sort of emerging area, which is well worth a listen. So thank you for that. How can we find out more about Rize ETF? Where's the website and things?
So the website is www.rizeetf.com. And on there, we've recently done a webinar on the medical cannabis opportunity which we did in conjunction with New Frontier Data, who are the experts that back the theme that I mentioned. So they're the experts who helped us construct the universe. So there's lots of information on there in that webinar, but there's also a lot of information in our research and insights section around the theme, medical cannabis in the UK, in Europe, and a white paper as well. So there's a lot of information there that people can read, and it's very, very insightful. There's a lot of surprises in there. For example, GW Pharma, that a lot of UK investors, for example, who are asking, how can I invest in this sector? They don't necessarily know about that.
No, absolutely. We'll put a link in our show notes to the website and the webinar, so our listeners can find those nice and easy. Stuart, thanks for your time.
Cool. All right. Thanks a lot.
A big thank you to Stuart for joining us for this episode of Informed Choice Radio. I have to say, I learnt an awful lot about the investment in the cannabis market in that conversation. Stuff I didn't know before, particularly the comparables between the size of the medical cannabis market and the recreational market, which I guess is what we all think about when we think about cannabis, marijuana, pot. So really interesting there. It'll be very interesting to see how that market develops and how investment opportunities within that market develop too. A quick disclaimer, I must say, say this whenever we talk about investments on the Informed Choice Radio podcast. Whilst I'm a financial planner, I am not your financial planner. So nothing we talk about in this episode should be construed as investment advice. Please do go away and seek independent financial advice from a professional, someone who is authorised and regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. Before you make an investment, particularly in any of the areas we discussed today, take advice, be sensible, be smart about this. But nothing in this conversation was advice, it was information, it was entertainment, let's put it that way. So with that disclaimer out of the way, thank you again to Stuart for joining us on this episode. Until next time, I'm Martin Bamford, this is Informed Choice Radio, and remember, when it comes to your money, the more you know, the faster it can grow.